So we've discussed a lot about standard form categorical statements, and now what we're going to do is we're going to start talking about standard form categorical syllogisms, okay? So standard form categorical syllogisms, what are they? Well, a standard form categorical syllogism is a syllogism that is constituted by all standard form categorical statements. Now, we know what standard form categorical statements are, but you might not know what a syllogism is. So a syllogism is a deductive argument that is constituted by two premises and one conclusion, okay? So a syllogism, any syllogism, not just categorical syllogisms, but there are also hypothetical syllogisms. Any syllogism is a deductive argument that is constituted by three statements. Two of those are premises, and one of those will be a conclusion, okay? This will always be the case for any kind of syllogism, as well as a standard form categorical syllogism. Furthermore, for a standard form categorical syllogism, you'll have three terms in that argument, okay? So we've discussed how standard form categorical statements have terms, subject terms, and predicate terms, okay? But when we look at standard form categorical syllogisms, an argument basically created by or constituted by standard form categorical statements, you're going to only have three terms. Okay, and we'll discuss what these terms are a little later on. Furthermore, you have a specific order of statements that the statements in a standard form categorical syllogism will take, and we'll discuss this further as well. Okay, so here we have an example of a standard form categorical syllogism. Now, the first thing to note about this example is that it is a deductive argument, okay? And not only is it a deductive argument, but it is constituted by three statements. 1, 2, 3. And two of these statements are premises, and one of them is a conclusion. Okay, so this is why it's actually a syllogism. Furthermore, you have all of these statements being standard form categorical statements. Now notice how here we actually have three different kinds of terms. We have the minor term, the major term, and the middle term. Okay? Now, the minor term is going to be the subject term of the conclusion. Okay? So the subject term of the conclusion will always define the minor term. And in a standard form categorical syllogism, we're going to represent that minor term with the letter S, okay, to indicate the subject term of the conclusion. Okay? And that is going to be the minor term for the argument. Okay? We also have the major term, and the major term for a standard form categorical syllogism will always be the predicate term of the conclusion. Okay? So in this case, we're going to represent the major term with the letter P to represent the predicate term of the conclusion. Okay? And that's going to be the major term. Now notice how we have the minor term represented by the S for the subject of the conclusion, okay, here in this premise, as well as the major term, okay, which is the predicate term of the conclusion, here as in the premise as well. Now, the subject term and the major term will always also occur in the premises, okay? One of the terms, the subject terms, will be in the what is called the minor premise, okay, and the predicate term of the conclusion, the major term, will appear in the major premise, okay? So notice how we have three different kinds of statements. We have the major premise, the minor premise, and the conclusion, okay? The conclusion will always take this bottom position, the third position, okay? And the major premise will be the premise that contains the major term, okay, which is represented by the P here. And the minor premise will be the premise that contains the minor term, which is represented by this S here, okay? And the major and minor premises will always appear in this order, where you have the major premise first at top, the minor premise second in the middle, okay? Finally, we also have the middle term. And the middle term in this case is dedicated students. Okay, and it occurs here in this premise, the major premise, as well as here in the minor premise, okay? So the middle term is always going to be the term that is shared by both premises, okay? It's the only term that occurs twice in the premises, okay? Notice how the minor term occurs once, and the major term occurs once, but the middle term occurs twice. And the middle term is supposed to be the term that connects the two premises together, okay? So these are the standard features of a standard form categorical syllogism, okay? You will always have a deductive argument with 3 statements, 2 premises, 1 conclusion, 3 terms, the minor term, major term, and middle term, and the premises will occur in a certain order, major premise first, then minor premise, and then the conclusion, okay? Okay, now how is it that we can translate ordinary language categorical syllogisms into standard form categorical syllogisms? Okay, well, first we want to make sure is that you correctly identify the premises and the conclusion. Okay, this is a key step, and you want to make sure to correctly identify the conclusion because it's the conclusion that will tell you what the minor and major terms are. Okay, and it's really important that you correctly identify the minor and major terms because if you don't, you're going to get the form incorrect, okay, or the structure of the argument incorrect. Then you make sure that you translate all the statements into standard form categorical statements. And we've discussed in past lectures how you would do this, how you go from ordinary language to standard form categorical statements, okay? Then you want to make sure that you only have 3 terms. Okay, so you want to make sure that you only have 3 terms, a minor term, a major term, and a middle term. And if you end up with more than 3 terms, you have to try to figure out whether or not you can actually change at least one of those terms, okay, such that you can make the argument have only 3 terms. And this usually occurs when you have premises or conclusions that use not only terms but also term complements. Okay, and we'll discuss this a little bit further later on. Finally, you make sure that the premises are in the correct order. Remember, for a standard form categorical syllogism, you need to make sure that the premises are in the order of major premise at top, minor premise in the middle, and then the conclusion at the bottom. Okay? So here we have an example of an argument in ordinary language. Since all cats are mammals and some mammals are warm-blooded animals, it follows that some cats are warm-blooded animals. Now, the first step that we want to take is to identify the premises and the conclusion. And we've learned how to do this by using premise indicators and conclusion indicators. And when we don't have premise indicators or conclusion indicators, remember, you have to think about the relationships between the statements. So in this case, we do have premise indicators and conclusion indicators. So we have since as a premise indicator, and it tells us that the statement, all cats are mammals, okay, as well as the statement, some mammals are warm-blooded animals, are both premises. And the reason why it tells us that both of these are premises is because there's an and being used here. So because there's an and being used here, this since not only points to the first statement as being a premise, but also that second statement, okay? Also, we have it follows that, and that's a conclusion indicator, okay? So that tells us that some cats are warm-blooded animals is going to be the conclusion. So we have identified here 2 premises, okay, and 1 conclusion. So we actually do know that it is a syllogism. Okay, so now that we've identified the premises and the conclusion, you need to ask yourself, well, how am I going to identify the minor term and the major term and the middle term in order to make sure that the premises are in the correct order? In order to identify the major and minor terms, always look to the conclusion first, okay? The subject term of the conclusion will always be the minor term of the argument, and the predicate term of the conclusion will always be the major term of the argument. So here we have the argument where we have identified the specific premises and the conclusion. Notice how we have yet to identify the minor premises, the major premises. So premise 1 and premise 2 are different from minor premises and major premises. Premise 1 and premise 2 refers to the premises in the order that they were given in the argument. Major premise and minor premise refers to the premises in terms of which premise has the major term and which premise has the minor term. So what we want to do is first identify the major and minor terms, and we do so by looking at the conclusion. And remember, it is the subject term of the conclusion that is the minor term. Okay? And it is the predicate term of the conclusion that will be the major term. Okay? So because we know that now cats is the minor term and warm-blooded animals is the major term, we know that here cat is going to be the minor term here, and warm-blooded animals is going to be the major term here. After we've identified this, you can see that our premises are in the wrong order. Why? Because up here, premise 1 is actually the minor premise. Okay? And the reason why it's the minor premise is because it has the minor term in it, which is cat. Okay? And premise 2 here is the major premise. Okay? And the reason why it is the major premise is because it has the predicate term of the conclusion, which is the major term, warm-blooded animals. Okay? Finally, we can also see here that the middle term is mammals. Okay? And we'll represent that with an M. Why? Because it is a term that is shared between both the premises and does not occur in the conclusion. Okay? Okay, so after we've looked at this and we notice that we have 3 statements here, and 2 of those are premises, 1 of them is a conclusion. We have 3 terms, the minor term, the major term, and the middle term. Okay? And all of these statements are indeed standard form categorical statements. So we don't have to actually worry about translating these statements here. However, notice that one problem, and the major problem with this argument, is that the premises are in the wrong order. Notice how the minor premise is up top and the major premise is here in the second position in the middle. So in order to put this into a standard form categorical syllogism, what we will need to do is simply switch those premises. Okay? Okay, so a little overview on what we just spoke about. So here we have an argument that was given to us in ordinary language, and we identified the premises and the conclusion. Okay? And now we want to turn it into standard form. And to do so, what we want to do is first identify the major terms and the minor terms. And how we do so is identify the subject term of the conclusion and the predicate term of the conclusion. The subject term of the conclusion is the minor term, and the predicate term of the conclusion is the major term. Then, after we identify the subject term of the conclusion and the predicate term of the conclusion, which gives us our minor and major term, we can identify our minor and major premises. Okay? So our minor premise is the premise that contains the subject term of the conclusion, which is the minor term, and our major premise is the premise that contains the predicate term of the conclusion, which is the major term. Okay? And then we can also identify the middle term, which is the term that is shared by both of the premises. Okay? Now, again, notice how the minor premise and the major premise are out of order. Okay, and this is the only thing wrong with this argument. That's why it's not in standard form. Everything else is right. Okay, so we go ahead and switch those premises. Okay, so now this argument is in standard form. This is a standard form categorical syllogism. All the premises are in the right order. We have only 3 terms. We have the S term, the M term, and the P terms. Okay, they're all standard form categorical statements. We have 2 premises, 1 conclusion, and it is a deductive argument. Okay. Now here's another example of an argument given to us in ordinary language. Everyone who is 18 years of age or older is eligible to vote. My brother John is older than 18, so he can vote. Now notice how in this argument we don't have premise indicators, but we do have a conclusion indicator to help us identify the conclusion. So is a conclusion indicator, and this tells us that he can vote is going to be the conclusion. Now, given that we were able to identify this statement here as the conclusion, this also tells us that the other 2 statements everyone who is 18 years of age or older is eligible to vote is a premise, and my brother John is older than 18 is another premise, okay? So here we have premise 1, here we have premise 2, and this is the conclusion, okay? So here we have the premise, everyone who is 18 years of age or older is eligible to vote. My brother John is older than 18, and my brother John can vote. Okay? Now, notice how these statements are not in standard form. Okay? These are not standard form categorical statements. So part of our job to turn this argument into a standard form categorical statement is to translate these statements into standard form categorical statements. And you've learned how to do this in the past lectures. Okay? So we have the statement, everyone who is 18 years of age or older is eligible to vote. Okay? And we're going to translate that to all citizens 18 or older are citizens who can vote. Now, everyone tells us that we're talking about all as the quantifier, okay? Who is 18 years of age or older, okay, gets translated to citizens 18 or older, okay? And then we inserted the copula are, and then eligible to vote turns into citizens who can vote, okay? So this is the subject term of this statement, and this will be the predicate term of this statement, okay? I'm talking about statements here, okay? And then we have, my brother John is older than 18. Now, remember, we're talking about a particular person, okay? So when we talk about a particular person, we want to use parameters like all people identical to when we're talking about people, all places identical to when we're talking about a specific place, all times identical to when we're talking about a specific time, okay? So here, my brother John turns into all as a quantifier, people identical to my brother. Okay, and we can even add in here people identical to my brother John, okay? And then we have are as the copula, so this did not have a standard copula. And then older than 18 gets turned into the predicate, citizens 18 or older, okay? So this is the subject term of this statement, and this is the predicate term of this statement. And then finally the conclusion, my brother John can vote, okay? Again, we use a parameter because it's talking about a specific person, a particular person, my brother John, okay? So we'll use all as a quantifier, and people identical to my brother, again, okay, as the subject term, okay? Then are becomes the copula, and citizens who can vote as the predicate term, okay? So now we've translated these ordinary language statements into standard form categorical statements. This one here is an A-type statement, and so is this one, and so is this one. Notice the structure, all SRP, and all SRP. This is the pattern or structure of a standard form A-type statement, okay? So now that we've translated all the statements into standard form categorical statements, what we can do is identify the major terms and the minor terms, as well as the major premise and the minor premise, and the middle terms. So now what we want to do is identify the minor term of the argument, okay? And we're talking about terms of the argument, not terms of the statement, okay? So statements have predicate terms and subject terms. The argument as a syllogism has a major term, a minor term, and a middle term, okay? So the subject term of the conclusion is going to be the minor term, okay, of the argument. And the predicate term of the conclusion will be the major term of the argument, okay? And so we see that the subject term of the conclusion, which is the minor term, occurs here, and the predicate term of the conclusion, which is the major term, occurs here, okay? And this helps us identify this premise here, the first premise, as the major premise, and the second premise as the minor premise. The major premise is the premise that contains the major term. The minor premise is a premise that contains the minor term, okay? Then we can identify also the middle term, which is citizens 18 or older, okay? Because this is a term that's shared between both premises, okay? So we check this. And we can see that we have all the criteria that we need for a standard form categorical syllogism now. Okay? All the statements are now standard form categorical statements. Okay? We only have 3 terms within the argument: the minor term, the major term, and the middle term. Okay? So remember, M is the middle term. Okay? And all the premises are in the right order. We have major premise at top, the minor premise in the middle, and then the conclusion on the bottom. Okay? So now this is in standard form. Okay? Now once we put a categorical syllogism into standard form, so we have a standard form categorical syllogism, what we can also do is identify the form of that argument, which is basically the structure of that argument without the content, okay? And the content specifically refers to the specific information that's contained in the argument, like people identical to my brother, citizens who can vote, okay? So when we want to determine what the form or simply the structure or pattern that the argument takes, we simply take the content out, okay? So the information that's actually contained in each of the statements, okay? And we leave the variables, so the S's and the M's and the P's, to represent that information that we've taken out, okay? So when we take out the content, okay, we are simply left with the form of the argument, the structure, the pattern of reasoning that occurs in the argument itself. Notice we have all M are P as the major premise, all S are M as the minor premise, and all S are P as the conclusion. Okay? So in order to determine the form of the standard form categorical syllogism, the structure of the standard form categorical syllogism, we remove all the content, okay, basically what the terms represent, okay, and we leave the variables in there. So we leave the S's, P's, and the M's, and we also leave the quantifier and the copula, okay? So this is what we'll have, okay? All M are P, all S are M, all S are P, okay? And this is the form of the argument that we actually had. And notice we also want to provide a dictionary. So here this dictionary tells us that the S in this form represents people identical to my brother. The P in this argument represents citizens who can vote. And the M in this argument represents citizens 18 or older. Okay? So this is the form, this is the dictionary. Okay? So here's another argument that we have that we can actually translate into a standard form categorical syllogism. Okay? And this one's a little bit more complicated, but the same procedures apply. Okay? So you have no elephants are non-alligators, and some alligators are not horses. Therefore, some elephants are not horses. Now in this argument as well, we have a conclusion indicator that will help us identify the conclusion. So therefore is a conclusion indicator, and that tells us that some elephants are not horses is the conclusion, okay? This helps us by elimination identify the only remaining statements left as the premises. So no elephants are non-alligators will be one premise, okay? And some alligators are not horses will be another premise, okay? So here we went ahead and identified those. Premise 1, no elephants are non-alligators. Premise 2, some alligators are not horses. And then conclusion, some elephants are not horses. Okay, so now that we've identified all of the premises and the conclusion, one thing that we want to do is make sure that we have only 3 terms, okay? So notice how all of these statements are actually standard form categorical statements. No elephants are non-alligators is a standard form E-type statement. Some alligators are not horses is a standard form O-type statement. And some elephants are not horses is also a standard form O-type statement. Okay, now given that these are all standard form categorical statements, what we also want to look at is to make sure that there are only 3 terms. Okay, so notice some elephants are not horses is our conclusion. So that will tell us that elephants is our minor term, which we will represent with an S, and horses will be our major term, which we will represent with a P, okay? And we have elephants up here, okay? And we have horses up here, okay, which is a P, okay? However, notice here we have actually two different terms for the middle term. We have alligators, which is M, which is the middle term. However, here we have non-alligators, which is non-M, okay? So for this argument, we actually have four terms. We have the subject term of the conclusion, which is the minor term, the predicate term of the conclusion, which is the major term, and then for the middle terms, we have two things. We have M, alligators, as well as its term complement, non-M, non-alligators, okay? So this is a problem. So what we want to do when we turn this into a standard form categorical syllogism is to try to figure out a way to get rid of this non here, this term complement, and turn it into an M. Okay, and we can use our operations that we learned in the past, okay, of either aversion or contraposition, okay, in order to figure out how to get rid of those non-M's. You can also use conversion in conjunction with either aversion or contraposition if you have statements that require more than one operation in order to get rid of those term complements, okay? So here we have no elephants are non-alligators, and what we want to do is use one of our operations in order to try to get rid of that non, okay? So in order to replace that term complement with the term itself, okay? So we can actually do this with aversion. Now remember, aversion has two rules, right? You want to change the quality without changing the quantity, and then you want to replace the predicate term with its term complement. Okay, so here we have a negative statement that's a universal, which is indicated by the no quantifier. And we want to change the quality of the statement without changing the quantity, so we go from no to all. Okay, then we want to change the predicate term with its term complement. So in this case, the predicate term is non-P. Okay, and we want to replace that with its term complement, which is P, alligators, okay? So remember, non-alligators or non-P is the term complement for P, and P, alligators, is the term complement for non-P, okay? So these are related to each other in terms of terms and term complements, okay? So here then we have all elephants are alligators as our first premise. Some alligators are not horses as our second premise, and some elephants are not horses as our conclusion, okay? Now, after we went ahead and translated this statement here, which has the term complement, into a standard form categorical statement that does not have a term complement, okay, we can see that we only have three terms in this argument now, okay? So now we have the conclusion, which has the minor term and the major term, okay? The subject of the conclusion, which is the minor term, elephants, and the predicate of the conclusion, which is the major term, horses. And those terms occur here and here as well, okay? And then we have here alligators as the middle term, okay? So we only have three terms in this statement now, okay? Now, after we've identified all the terms and we make sure that there are only three terms, we want to make sure that the premises are in the correct order. So again, the major premise is the premise that takes the first position, and it's the premise that contains the major term, which is the predicate of the conclusion, okay? So this is going to tell us that premise 2, some alligators are not horses, is actually the major premise, okay? So this is actually the major premise, okay, because it contains the major term, and all elephants are alligators is actually the minor premise, okay, because it contains the minor term, okay? So then we look at the argument and we have to notice that our premises are out of order, okay? Because you always have to have the major premise in the first position and the minor premise in the second position, okay? The middle position. So we want to go ahead, and our final move to turn this into a standard form categorical syllogism is to switch those premises. Okay, so we'll go ahead and put the major premise in the top position, the minor premise in the middle position, and then the conclusion remains at the bottom last third position. Okay? Now, once we have put a categorical syllogism into a standard form categorical syllogism, what we can do at this point is identify the form of the argument, okay? And the form is going to be the structure or pattern of the argument without the content, okay? We remove the information that's actually contained in the statements, okay, the specific information, and we leave the variables behind along with the quantifiers and the copula. So if we remove the content in this case, we would remove alligators, we would remove horses, and we would replace them with the variables m and p respectively. We would remove elephants and remove alligators, replace them with s and m respectively, and again remove elephants and remove horses and replace them with s and p respectively. Okay? Now when we do so, notice we leave the quantifiers, okay, and we leave the copulas, okay? So we're simply removing the content, which is the specific information that's contained in each of these statements, okay? When we do that, we end up with the form, okay? So this is the form of the argument that we just had. Some m are not p, all s are m, some s are not p. Okay, and this tells us what the structure of the argument is, what the pattern of reasoning of that argument is, okay? And along with the form, we also have, again, the dictionary, okay? So the dictionary tells us what each of these variables stands for. So the S stands for elephants, the P stands for horses, and the M stands for alligators. So we could simply include this or replace these variables with whatever term that each of these variables stands for and read the statements back as just given standard form categorical statements, right? Some alligators are not horses, all elephants are alligators, some elephants are not horses, okay? So that's the relationship between the variables and the terms, okay? So here, once again, we have the form, and this is the dictionary, okay? Okay, now, once we've identified the form and structure of a standard form categorical syllogisms, what we can do is we can identify the specific name of that standard form categorical syllogism, okay? There are actually 256 different types of standard form categorical syllogisms, and these types are all different forms, okay? Each of them represents a different pattern of reasoning that a standard form categorical syllogism can take. And each of these standard form categorical syllogisms, each of the forms, okay, can have a mood and figure. And the mood and the figure determines the name of that specific form, that specific pattern of reasoning that a standard form categorical syllogism can take, okay? There are 15 out of 256 valid forms, standard form categorical syllogisms, and we're going to learn how to actually determine the validity of these various standard form categorical syllogisms two different ways, okay? And we'll actually do that in part 2 of lesson 4. But before we move on to that, let's go ahead and discuss how to identify all 256 different types or forms of standard form categorical syllogisms. Okay? And it's actually very easy once you know the method. Okay? So first what you want to do is start with the mood. And the mood is very simple to identify. What you want to do is first make sure that you have a standard form categorical syllogism. In order to identify the mood, you must make sure that the argument you have is in standard form, okay? You have to first make sure that it is a standard form categorical syllogism. So here we have an argument that is in standard form, and we actually worked on it a little bit earlier, made sure that it was in standard form. it meets all the criteria of a standard form categorical syllogism. And what we want to do after that, in order to identify the mood, is simply identify the type of statement, the type of standard form categorical statement that makes up this standard form categorical syllogism. Now here we have some animals are warm-blooded, and this is an I-type statement. Okay? And here we have all cats are mammals, and this is an A-type statement. And here we have some cats are warm-blooded, and this is also an I-type statement. Okay? So because we have the major premise being an I-type statement, and the minor premise being an A-type statement, and the conclusion being an I-type statement, the mood of this argument is I-A-I. And we specifically write it in this order, okay? We write the major premise in this first position of the letter, the minor premise in this second position in this order, and the conclusion goes in this third position, okay? So this is the mood of the argument. The mood identifies the type of statements that make up the standard form categorical syllogism, okay? And those statement types are put in specific order, the major premise type first, the minor premise type second, and the conclusion type third, okay? So this is the mood, I-A-I, okay? Then we can identify the figure of the standard form categorical syllogism. Okay? So the figure of a standard form categorical syllogism is determined by the placement of the middle term, which also determines the placement of the minor and major terms in the premises. Okay? So here we have the argument again, and notice how we have the middle term occurring here as well as here. Okay, so this actually tells us, because the middle term occurs in the first position as the major premise and the second position as the minor premise, that this is a figure 1. Okay, how do we know that this is a figure 1? Well, there is a nifty little chart, okay, that tells us that that's a figure 1. Okay, so here we have the chart that tells us what the different figures are, and if you've noticed, there are 4 different figures, and you will have a similar chart that's actually in your book, okay? So this is figure 1, okay, and this is figure 2, this is figure 3, and this is figure 4. The figures are static. They always will remain the same, and there are only 4 figures, okay? So notice how you have M, P, S, M, and SP. Okay, what these letters stands for is the minor term, the major term, and the M stands for the middle term, okay, in a standard form categorical syllogism. So if you have something like all M are P, okay, and no S are M, and some S are P, then this form of a standard form categorical syllogism will take the figure 1, okay? Because the M's are in, first of all, in the major premise, the first position, and in the minor premise, the second position, and then you have S in the first position of the minor premise and P in the second position of the major premise. Okay, so the pattern that's going on here will determine the form, okay? So one easy way to actually memorize, if you'd like to, how the different figures work is to memorize it in terms of what's called the collar formation, okay? Notice how the M's here are diagonal, and then the M's here go up and down, and then the M here goes up and down as well, and then the M's here are diagonal. So this forms essentially a collar, okay? And you can memorize the figures, okay, by this collar formation. You can also only memorize half of this, okay, as long as you understand that half of the chart, okay, so the first 2 figures are mirror images of the last 2 figures, okay? So if you memorize this first half where the M's go M, M, diagonal, so it's M, P, S, M, and then the figure 2 is P, M, S, M, then you can memorize the other half as being the mirror image of this first half, the figure 3 being M, P, M, S, and figure 4 being P, M, M, S, okay? So that's how we identify the figure of a standard form categorical syllogism. And now, once we know how to identify the mood and the figure, we can bring these together for the mood and figure. And the mood and figure combined tells us specifically the type of categorical syllogism we have, okay? The type of categorical syllogism identifies the form or the pattern of reasoning, the structure that the argument is using, okay? So putting the mood and the figure together, we have IAI types of statements, the I type statement for the major premise, A type statement for the minor premise, and then the I type statement for the conclusion. So the mood then is IAI, okay? And it's specifically in that order once again, major premise, minor premise, then the conclusion. And then we put a little dash in between and we put the figure. And this again we said was figure 1. And the reason for that is because if you notice, the middle terms go diagonal, okay, where in the major premise the M takes the first position, okay, the subject term position, and then in the minor premise the M takes the second position, the predicate term position, and then in the major premise we have the major term, which is represented by the P in the second position, and the minor term occurs in the minor premise in the first position. And we're going to always write the mood and figure together like this, IAI1 with a dash in between the mood and the figure. And this represents the type of categorical syllogism we have, okay? This basically tells us what the form or structure of this categorical syllogism is, okay? Okay, so let's go ahead and identify the mood and the figure of this categorical syllogism. Now, we've already went from the categorical syllogism in ordinary language to the form of the categorical syllogism through translation and then making sure that it's a standard form categorical syllogism. And here we have the form, okay? And we have the dictionary over here, which tells us what each of these variables stands for. So this argument here will be all citizens 18 or older are citizens who can vote. All people identical to my brother are citizens 18 or older, and then the conclusion, all people identical to my brother are citizens who can vote, okay? So that's the argument that we're specifically working with here, and we went ahead and narrowed it down to its form, okay? Now, based on the form, we could identify the mood and figure, okay? So this is an A-type statement, standard form. This is also an A-type statement, and this is also an A-type statement. So we know that the mood of this argument is AAA, okay? And then we can see here the placement of the middle terms in the premises. We have the M here and the M here. And this is exactly the same placement as you would have in figure 1, okay? So the figure is 1. Okay, so the mood and figure of this argument is AAA-1, and this represents the type of standard form categorical syllogism that we have, okay, which specifically tells us what the form will look like, okay? Okay, here we have another example. So again, we've gone ahead and taken the categorical syllogism given in ordinary language and reduced it down to its form, okay? And here we have the dictionary here. So this argument is the argument, some alligators are horses, all elephants are alligators, some elephants are not horses, okay? And given this argument, we can go ahead and identify the mood and figure, okay? So here we have a I-type statement, okay? I-type standard form categorical statement, and here we have an A-type standard form categorical statement, and this is an O-type standard form categorical statement. So this will tell us that the mood of this argument is IAO, okay? So IAO, and remember, this is in standard form, so we know that the premises are in the correct order. If you fail to actually put the argument in standard form before you identify the mood and figure, you're going to end up with the wrong mood and figure, okay? So you always want to make sure before you identify the mood and figure of the argument that you make sure that it's in standard form, okay? That it is a standard form categorical syllogism. Then, when we want to identify the figure, again, we look at the placement of the middle terms, okay? And here are the middle terms here in the premises. And notice, again, we have this diagonal effect. In the major premise, the middle term takes the first position, and in the minor premise, the middle term takes the second position. So this, again, is going to be figure 1, okay? So the mood and figure for this argument is IAO1, and that's the type of standard form categorical syllogism this argument is.